It was April of 1945, and the roads of southern Germany had taken on the look of history collapsing in real time. What had once been orderly lanes between villages were now slow rivers of exhausted people pushing forward because there was no longer anything behind them worth remaining for. Women carried children whose eyes no longer searched. Old men walked with steps so measured one might think they were counting the distance to collapse. The war was ending, but its ending was not gentle. It frayed everything: homes, nations, and whatever remained inside the people moving along those roads. On a small rise overlooking one such road, a U.S. Marine reconnaissance attachment had halted. Their presence here was unusual. Marines were more often associated with Pacific Islands than Bavarian farmland. But this unit, temporarily attached to the Office of Strategic Services alongside the U.S. 7th Army, had been advancing southward for days. Their job was to scout crossings, note defensive positions, and remain small enough to move unseen. The war had shifted continents for them, but its demands were unchanged. Stay alert, stay moving, stay alive. Lieutenant Harris stood at the crest of the hill, his posture calm, his silence steady. He was not a loud leader. His authority came from the way he carried stillness. Corporal Dunn sat on an overturned ammunition tin, chewing a stalk of dry grass simply to keep restless hands occupied. The Navy corpsman, Petty Officer Ellis, knelt beside a small canteen stove, heating water with deliberate, almost ceremonial care. His medical bag rested beside him, light, too light, and getting lighter each day. He knew precisely what was inside without opening it: 2 dressings, a pinch of sulfa powder, a few tablets, 1 morphine syringe. Enough to save 1 life well or several poorly. War rewarded calculation more than kindness. The refugees continued down the road, their steps slow, faces blank with fatigue that had advanced beyond emotion. Many came from the east, fleeing the Soviet advance. Rumors of retribution had traveled farther than armies, stripped of context but not of impact. No one could say exactly what awaited them if they stayed behind, but fear had its own clarity. Dunn exhaled. "Never seen people walk like that," he murmured. "Like moving forward is the only thing they remember how to do." "They know enough," Harris replied. "A way is a direction." Ellis remained quiet. He had learned long ago that when supplies became scarce, silence became its own kind of discipline. Every bandage saved now might be a life preserved later. But he also knew the difference between triage and abandonment. That line haunted him. Then a sound rose through the quiet, soft, broken rung. Not the steady shuffle of the column. Not conversation. A rasping breath pulled through pain. Ellis lifted his head. Down the slope, near a collapsed cart half sunk in mud, lay a young woman. She could not have been more than 22. Her dress was torn and dirt-stained, boots split open at the seams. Her hair clung to her face in fevered strands. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven pulls. She was alive, but precariously so. Ellis moved without request or order, sliding down toward her. Harris and Dunn followed, rifles lowered but ready. Ellis pressed 2 fingers to her neck, a pulse thin and fluttering. He pulled aside a strip of makeshift bandage near her ribs. The wound beneath was unmistakable. Shrapnel, likely from artillery days earlier, infected now, red-streaked and foul-smelling. Sepsis had already begun its quiet, methodical work. "How long?" Harris asked. Ellis didn't look up. "If we walk away, an hour, maybe." Dunn inhaled sharply. "Sir, orders." They all knew what the orders were. Conserve medical supplies. Avoid civilian entanglement. Their mission was movement, not mercy. But there are moments when orders stand in the presence of suffering and feel suddenly small. Harris's silence stretched. Not hesitation, simply the weight of choice. The war was almost over, but almost had cost plenty already. He nodded once. Ellis opened his bag. Sulfa powder. Dressings. Canteen water boiled moments earlier, as if fate had known before they did. His movements were efficient, steady. He cleaned the wound as gently as if she were a sister. The woman stirred, whispering words in German, fragmented, dreamlike apologies or memories. Ellis did not understand the language, but suffering was universal. Harris placed a quiet hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said softly, though the world did not make that promise. When Ellis finished, he leaned back. The wound was clean, though that alone did not guarantee survival. The dressings were used. His bag was lighter still. To save her meant carrying her. Carrying her meant slowing their pace, increasing their exposure, risking their lives for one they had never met. Ellis did not speak. He simply looked at Harris. Harris returned the look and nodded a second time. Dunn fetched pieces of the broken cart and helped Ellis fashion a stretcher. No one complained. No one argued. Once a decision was made, they followed it as soldiers do. They lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, Starvation and exhaustion had reduced her to bone and breath, but her presence changed the road ahead. They began walking. The ground was soft from recent rain, mud grasping at their boots. The woman's breathing fluttered, uneven but there. Ellis watched her face for signs of slipping back into darkness. She held on. They passed a burned wagon, a child's wooden toy beside it, paint worn away. No one paused. War did not allow pauses. As they rounded a bend, the trees thickened. The road narrowed. Harris's grip on his rifle shifted, readiness tightening around him like a second skin. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, an engine rumbled. Slow, approaching, unknown. They did not stop walking, but every heartbeat sharpened, and every breath grew deliberate. Whatever waited ahead, aid or danger, they were already committed. They would not put her down. The rumble of the engine drew closer, low and uneven, as though the machine itself shared the exhaustion that weighed over the countryside. The Marines halted just off the road, lowering the stretcher carefully. The young woman lay motionless now, her breath shallow but steady. Lieutenant Harris raised a fist and the patrol froze among the trees. The branches were sparse enough for them to see the movement ahead. An old civilian truck, paint chipped to raw metal, crawling along the broken road. Two men walked beside it, gaunt and wary, rifles slung but not raised. Refugees or deserters or farmers conscripted too late into a war that was already finished. The unknowns of the moment crackled like static in the air. The Marines held their breath, not from fear, but from the instinctive caution that the final days of war demanded. Harris signaled for silence. The truck passed. The men did not look toward the trees. They had the hollow-eyed focus of people who had stopped caring what might be watching. Only when the truck disappeared around the bend did Harris lower his arm. The Marines exhaled, slow and controlled. One danger avoided, countless others waiting. Dunn eased his grip on his rifle and wiped his palm on his trouser leg. "If this war ends any slower," he muttered, "we'll be old men before we see home." Ellis didn't respond. His thoughts were narrowed to the woman at their feet. He examined her face. Fever had flushed her cheeks. Her lips twitched, forming shapes that almost resembled words. Whatever she had been running from had nearly taken her. Whatever she had hoped to reach had not arrived in time. Harris crouched beside her. "How long will she last?" His voice was low, not in secrecy, but in recognition of the gravity of the moment. Ellis placed his hand near her throat again. "The dressing will hold for now, but the infection is in her blood. She needs a doctor. A real one. And soon." There was no accusation, no plea, only fact. Dunn looked between the two men. "Sir, we're supposed to be scouting crossings. If we're slowed, we risk losing the 7th Army's advance line, and we're on our last bandages as it is." He spoke with unease, not callousness. Orders were not mere instructions. They were the structure keeping soldiers alive. Breaking them was not a small matter. Harris understood this better than anyone. Responsibility had a weight that didn't distribute evenly. It rested on leaders like a stone. Mutual understanding passed between the three men. They had already saved her, and by doing so, they had already stepped beyond the expected. Saving her had been instinct. Continuing to save her would require intention. The war was nearly over, but the rules had not dissolved. The Marine Corps manual did not have a chapter titled, "What to Do When Confronted with One's Civilian Life at the End of a Long War." Harris closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his mother writing letters by oil lamp. He thought of the long nights on Guadalcanal, when humanity felt like something distant and theoretical. "We do this properly," he said. "We take her to the nearest Army aid station." Dunn didn't look relieved, but he didn't protest. Ellis simply nodded and reached for the stretcher handles. Some decisions felt like stepping from one life into another. They lifted her again, careful and slow. The march resumed. The road stretched ahead in a winding gray coil, disappearing into a haze of smoke from distant shelling or burning fields. The smell of earth, rain, and decay hung heavy, mingling with the faint sweetness of spring budding out of season. War did not pause for seasons, but seasons did not pause for war. Small white blossoms were beginning to form on the branches overhead. Life persisted, stubborn and indifferent. Dunn noticed them, and for a brief second his eyes softened. Then the weight of the stretcher reminded him of the world he was in. Hours passed, though time felt strangely elastic. Moments elongated when danger was near and collapsed when the road grew monotonous. The Marines spoke little. The sound of boots in mud was steady and constant. The refugee woman murmured now and then, fragments of memory breaking through fever. Ellis listened for meaning, but what he heard were emotions without grammar. Grief, fear, apology. Once she whispered what sounded like a name. Ellis repeated it under his breath, careful, testing the shape of it. He did not know if he pronounced it correctly, but the attempt itself felt necessary. Dunn glanced over. You think she knows where she is? Ellis shook his head. I think she knows she's not alone. That might be enough. Words like that hung for a long time in the air. None of them dared to comment further. Too much reflection invited thoughts better saved for quiet rooms and years when soldiers no longer flinched at sudden noise. By late afternoon, signs of military presence became more visible. Discarded ration tins, a collapsed signpost marking a former checkpoint, and finally the muffled echo of artillery far to the south. The 7th Army was advancing quickly now, accelerating toward what remained of German resistance. The Marines could follow that sound to find medical support. They pressed forward. The woman's breathing grew more strained. Her fever burned hotter. Harris could see her pulse fluttering in her neck, weak and rapid. Every step they took was a race without markers. Her life was measured not in days but minutes, stretched thin by chance and the stubborn human refusal to surrender entirely. When they reached a crossroads, Harris ordered a halt. He studied the ground, listening. Ella set down the stretcher and checked the bandage. The infection had not worsened, but neither had it improved. The wound looked cleaner, but her body was losing strength faster than it could rebuild. She needs morphine, Ella said quietly. We have one syringe left. Dunn inhaled, sharp and frustrated. That's for one of us if something goes wrong. Ellis did not look up. I know. Harris stood very still. He did not decide quickly. But once he decided, there was no wavering. Give it to her, he said. Dunn closed his eyes, accepting the outcome. Ellis prepared the injection with hands steady from years of handling pain he could not cure. He gave it carefully, and within moments a new softness eased the woman's features. Her breath steadied. Her body, no longer clenched in agony, found small rest. They lifted her again. The road descended into a valley where the sound of engines, voices, and orders became distinct. An army medical post was close now, close enough that they could smell antiseptic and smoke. Relief flickered through them, small and unspoken. They were going to deliver her to safety. They had done the impossible part. The ground leveled, the trees opened, and canvas tents came into view. But as they saw the aid station, they also saw the stretchers piled outside, the nurses moving with frantic, exhausted urgency, and the crates marked supplies exhausted stacked beside the entrance. War was ending, but mercy was still in short supply. And as they stepped forward, a voice called out to them firm and urgent, "Hold there. Who are you carrying?" The Marines did not answer immediately. They had reached the place they needed to reach. Now came the question of whether the world would meet them halfway. The voice that halted them carried the clipped urgency of a soldier who had seen too many stretcher bearers arrive too late. A young army captain stepped forward from the canvas triage station. His uniform was smeared with blood, dust, and the evidence of decisions made quickly under impossible conditions. He looked from the Marines to the woman they carried. His jaw tightened with the practiced restraint of someone who no longer reacted to tragedy but measured it. "She's a civilian," he said. "We're over capacity. We're prioritizing frontline casualties." Harris did not argue immediately. He set the stretcher down with deliberate care, as though placing the woman in a fragile world that could break with sound alone. "She's septic," Ellis said, stepping forward. "Shrapnel wound, 4 days maybe. She'll die without penicillin. You have penicillin." The captain did not reply at once. Behind him, nurses hurried between stretchers, bandages soaked through faster than they could be replaced. The air smelled of antiseptic, rot, and burnt fuel. The groans of men who had been brave long enough but could be brave no longer sounded like a low tide of human exhaustion. "We have enough to save soldiers." The captain answered quietly. "We do what we can, not what we wish." The sentence was not unkind. It was simply the shape of necessity. Ellis stepped closer. His voice did not rise, but it sharpened. "Then let me work under your tent. I trained under Navy surgeons at Camp Pendleton. I can assist with the soldiers too. Skilled hands for supplies, trade." The captain looked at him, considering the offer. In war, everything could become negotiation, even life, especially life. Harris added, "She isn't a combatant. She's one more life in this war that's taken enough, and we carried her here. That means something." The captain's gaze flicked between the 3 men. He was weighing not just medical logistics, but the kind of men standing before him. The Marines did not look desperate. They looked resolved, and resolution in the final days of war was often indistinguishable from mercy. Finally, the captain nodded. "Bring her inside." Relief did not show on the Marines' faces. They simply lifted the stretcher again and followed him into the triage tent. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through canvas stained by rain and smoke. Cots were arranged with the efficiency of necessity, leaving only narrow paths to walk. A nurse led them to an empty space near a table where instruments lay in careful disarray. Ellis moved immediately, washing his hands in a basin of cold, reused water. The nurse cleaned the woman's wound more thoroughly while Ellis prepared to assist. Her fever flushed deeper, though morphine had softened her expression. Her eyes opened once, unfocused, glimmering with the faint recognition that she was somewhere safer. Her lips parted and a whisper escaped, too soft to carry words, but enough to show she had not yet crossed the threshold beyond return. While the surgeons worked on a soldier with abdominal injuries 2 cots away, Ellis cleaned, drained, and redressed the woman's wound under the nurse's guidance. He worked with a quiet intensity that suggested both training and personal conviction. Dunn stood nearby, watching, unsure where to put the weight of his hands. He felt the impulse to stay alert, to scan for threats, yet the only danger here was the ticking clock of infection. Outside, artillery echoed like distant thunder, though no one flinched anymore. The war's violence had become background noise as natural as wind. Harris stood at the tent entrance watching the road, ensuring their presence did not draw the wrong attention. The aid station was a space where survival was earned one decision at a time. He did not want their choice to save one life to cost others. Ellis finished the procedure and stepped back. The captain approached, checking the woman's pulse and color. "She has a chance," he said. "Not a promise, a possibility." Possibility was all that remained in times like these. The nurse covered the woman with a thin blanket and placed her hands at her sides, as though returning dignity to a life that had nearly slipped from its own story. For a moment, the Marines allowed themselves the smallest release of tension. None smiled. None spoke of heroics, but something eased in the air around them like a knot loosening. Dunn broke the quiet first. "She had something in her hand," he murmured. He reached into the fold of the stretcher and drew out a small object, a photograph folded and worn. A young woman, the same woman, stood beside an older woman and a smiling boy near a farmhouse. The details were faint, but the warmth was plain. Family, roots, a world that had existed before artillery and hunger. Ellis looked at the photograph for a long moment. "She wasn't running from us," he said softly. "She was running to something she thought she could still reach." Dunn swallowed, and the edges of his expression changed. Not grief, not guilt, but something quieter and harder to name. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. They stepped outside the tent to breathe air that did not carry the concentrated sorrow of the injured. The sky was shifting to evening, the clouds taking on the faint lavender hue of spring twilight. Smoke from distant burning villages drifted lazily, as if the world itself were tired. Harris looked down the road where they had come from. "We'll rejoin the 7th line tomorrow," he said. "At first light," Dunn nodded. Ellis only sat on a crate, resting his forearms on his knees, staring at the dirt as if the earth itself might absorb his thoughts. The captain joined them outside. "She'll be weak for weeks, maybe longer, but she'll live." His voice was still measured, but something in it had softened, if only by degrees. "You could have left her. Most would have." Harris answered. "Most isn't all." The captain studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. The gesture did not need words. It acknowledged something shared between men who had seen too much but not yet lost the ability to act against the gravity of war. As night settled, the aid station became quieter. Lamps flickered low. The woman slept, breathing steadier now, her body no longer fighting alone. Ellis checked on her once more, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. She seemed younger without pain creasing her brow. Or perhaps simply more human. The Marines slept in shifts, though sleep here was thin and restless. At dawn, gray light seeped through the trees. Dew clung to everything. The road ahead waited. The war had not ended simply because they had chosen compassion. Before they left, the woman opened her eyes again. She looked at Ellis, confusion and clarity flickering like candlelight. She whispered that same name he had heard before. This time he understood enough to respond. "I'll make sure they know you're safe," he said, and though she could not fully comprehend his words, she felt the steadiness of them. They stepped away from the tent. Packs on, helmets on, rifles ready. The road stretched forward once more, but something had shifted. They no longer carried her weight, yet they felt it all the same. Years passed, as they always do after war's end. Though the endings are never as clean as the headlines claim, the Marines returned home in staggered waves, stepping back into lives that waited for them but did not quite fit in the way they remembered. Lieutenant Harris settled in Ohio, where the quiet fields seemed too open at first, as if danger might still be hiding behind the lines of corn. He married a schoolteacher and learned to sit on his porch without scanning the horizon. Dunn went west, drawn to places where the sky looked like it had no edges. He found work building fences, bridges, and barns, structures that held things together rather than tearing them apart. And Ellis, the corpsman, returned to the Navy hospitals for a time, until the constant proximity to pain became too familiar. He eventually opened a small clinic in a town no one would have reason to know. He was simply a doctor then, though he still moved with the quiet precision of someone who had once made decisions in mud and smoke. For a long time, none of them spoke of the woman. Not out of shame nor secrecy, but because the war had been full of stories that felt unfinished. There were men they tried to save who did not survive. There were civilians they could not reach in time. In war, memory sorted itself without permission. Some scenes faded while others stayed sharp without explanation, but all three of them carried the memory of the stretcher, the road, the fever, and the moment they chose to stop walking in a world that had demanded they always keep moving. Meanwhile, south of Munich, in a village rebuilt from ash and timber, the woman healed. Her name was Liesel, and when she woke in the medical tent after the fever broke, she did not know where she was. A nurse explained slowly, gently, that she had been found by American soldiers. Liesel did not speak for a long time after that, partly because her voice had grown weak, and partly because she was trying to understand how strangers had carried her, when so many around her had been forced to look out only for themselves. Her mother and younger brother, the two figures in the photograph, had not survived the journey west. She learned this months later, in a letter that arrived with a shaking hand and a black seal. Grief returned in a slow wave, the kind that does not shout but settles deep, but she also carried the memory of 3 men who had stopped for her. Their faces had been the last thing she saw clearly before the fever swallowed her. She did not know their names. Time after reading, the late morning light crossing the floor in silent shapes. He had not thought of himself as a savior. He had simply made a decision that felt necessary. Yet here was proof that the decision had become a life, he wrote back. His words were simple. He hoped she was well. He was glad she had found her footing again. He wished her peace. He did not mention the war. He did not need to. Dunn received his letter months later. It was forwarded twice before it reached him, a sign of how often he moved. He read it while sitting on the back of his truck, the mountains rising around him in wide, forgiving lines. He remembered the blossoms overhead, the photograph she had carried, and the moment he had realized that some burdens were worth their weight. He did not write back at first. He carried the letter folded in his wallet until the edges softened, as though it needed time to settle into him. When he finally did reply, the letter was short but sincere. He told her he hoped her world had found quiet again. He told her that he remembered her. Ellis was the last to receive his. It came to his clinic on a late autumn afternoon. He recognized the handwriting before he opened it. He read it standing up, then sat down slowly as if the weight of memory needed steady ground. She thanked him for treating her with dignity. She explained that she had wondered during the fever whether she might simply disappear without being seen. But he had seen her, not as a nameless casualty, but as a person worth carrying. Ellis did not cry, but something loosened in him that he had not realized was tense. He wrote back immediately. His letter was the longest. He told her that saving her had not been an interruption to the war, but a moment that reminded him why saving lives mattered at all. The war had produced destruction. She remembered the insignia on their uniforms, the eagle, globe, and anchor, and the way one of them spoke with soft certainty while tending her wound. This memory did not erase the sorrow she bore, but it created a small, steady thread of meaning she could hold on to when the world felt too frayed to grasp. In the early 1950s, aid organizations and veterans' archives began collecting testimonies from civilians displaced during the war. Liesel volunteered her account. It was the first time she told the story aloud. She described the road, the collapse, the fever, and the moment when hands had lifted her from the mud. One archivist, an American working in Stuttgart, listened closely. He asked questions. He took notes, and when she finished, he promised to try to locate the Marines who had carried her. Liesel did not expect him to succeed. War scattered people the way wind scatters leaves. There was no guarantee any of them were still alive or still reachable, but she gave him her story and her gratitude anyway. It was enough simply to know the words existed somewhere outside her own memory. It took nearly 2 years, but one spring morning, an envelope arrived in a small Ohio town. Harris had been fixing a fence post behind his house when his wife came out holding the mail. The envelope was thin and stamped with foreign postmarks. He wiped his hands and opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, as though each letter had been placed with care not to break. The letter explained who she was, what had happened after they left, and how she had survived because they had chosen to stop. Harris sat at the table for a long time in every direction, but what remained afterward were small acts that refused to be erased. The memory of 3 men choosing to stop. The memory of 1 woman choosing to live. Sometimes history clings to grand strategies and decisive victories, but sometimes it lingers in the moment one human being lifts another from the ground. Lives bend quietly around such moments. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.